true to peace negotiation and remain true to peace negotiation in Afghanistan is an open question, question for us to explore today, but also the withdrawal of foreign forces from Afghanistan in a way opens up opportunities for regional powers to meddle in the affairs of Afghanistan even more than before. So to explore all these questions, we're delighted to have Professor William Maley from Australian National University, Emeritus Professor William Maley, Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi from Trobe University, and Farkhondeh Akbari, also from Australian National University. All experts in the field with immense knowledge, a wealth of knowledge, and perfectly placed to discuss these issues with us. We are going to have a very strict format. All speakers are invited to speak for about 15 minutes to share their insights. And then after the three speakers, we'll open up the floor for Q&A. And the order of presentations will be with Professor Bill Maley first. Then we move on to Dr. Niamatullah Ibrahimi, and followed by Farkhondeh Akbari. So Bill, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shahram. It's a great opportunity to be able to share some thoughts about what's a fast-moving but challenging situation as well. What I want to do in my remarks is set a little bit of context for negotiation with respect to Afghanistan, offer some critical comments about the 29th February 2020 agreement that the United States struck with the Taliban, and then offer some concluding reflections about the challenges of moving forward from this point, particularly with respect to the prospects of there being any kind of interim or peace government put in place as the Americans withdraw their forces, something which was foreshadowed in a document leaked from US sources earlier this year by the new Biden administration. So let me begin with the observation that there is a long experience of attempting to solve problems in Afghanistan through international negotiations, but it's not a very promising history. If one looks at the 1988 Geneva Accords on Afghanistan, which provided a veil for the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan, they spectacularly failed to address issues of internal political order within Afghanistan itself, and in effect remitted to the battlefield the resolution of issues that separated the communist regime headed by Dr. Najibullah from the different parties of the Afghan resistance, the Mujahideen. And although the regime itself was sustained for some years by a massive flow of resources from the Soviet Union, when that was cut off at the end of 1991 following the failed coup attempt against Gorbachev, it really signed the death warrant for the communist regime, which collapsed in 1992. Now, the United Nations also became involved in what, from its point of view, proved a depressingly unproductive process in 1992 under the auspices of an envoy called Benon Sevan, who had hoped to replace the communist regime with a team of neutral technocrats under his patronage, but the speed with which the regime unraveled compromised his efforts in that respect, and far from managing a smooth transition, he instead found himself in a position where the UN provided hospitality to Dr. Najibullah, formerly head of the secret police of the communist regime, for some years in UN premises in Kabul before somebody dragged him out and killed him in 1996 when the Taliban took over the capital. So there is quite a history of peace processes in Afghanistan not working out in the ways in which the architects had foreshadowed or anticipated, and that's worth bearing in mind when one looks at the current situation. That is likely to be even more a problematic context if key parties are excluded from the negotiation process, and that was exactly what the Americans did when they struck an agreement with the Taliban in February last year in the absence of the Afghan government, which was not a party to the negotiations, but which the Americans committed to the Taliban would then release up to 5,000 combat or political prisoners that the Afghan government was holding. Needless to say, since this simply set the scene for those prisoners to return to the battlefield and attack Afghan targets, the Afghan government was deeply underwhelmed by this example of a diplomacy, and one really needs to go back to the Munich conference of 1938, where the fate of Czechoslovakia was debated by Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, Britain, and France in the absence of delegates from Czechoslovakia in order to find such a defective process. Having said that, it's also important to note just how defective the February 2020 agreement proved to be. Not just with hindsight, but at the time, it was very clear that it was an exit agreement for the United States rather than a peace agreement for Afghanistan. And it embodied a number of serious flaws which any specialist on diplomacy should have been able to identify very swiftly. One was that on the same day that the Americans signed their agreement with the Taliban, they signed a joint declaration with the Afghan government in Kabul, but the wording relating to prisoner releases differed between the two texts. It's always a bad idea to have floating texts with different wording dealing with the same issue, because it almost immediately creates ambiguities that can then be exploited to compromise the process of giving effect to any kind of agreement that's been struck. And in particular, the provision for prisoner exchange really was a booby trap that the Americans built into their own agreement, because since the prisoners with which the agreement dealt were not in the hands of the United States, it was only by imposing unwanted pressure on their ally, the Afghan government, which was actually the most pro-Western government in the region, that they were able to deliver on the commitment that they'd made. Incidentally, the Americans also committed at that stage that the forces of their allies would also be withdrawn in accordance with the timetable for withdrawal that was written into the agreement. And to the best of my knowledge, the allies had not been consulted in advance, let alone delegated to the Americans the right to make any such commitment. Again, a serious defect in diplomatic process. There were then 5 particular defects associated with the agreement which have haunted Afghanistan ever since then and deserve a certain amount of attention. The first was a fundamentally defective assumption that the Taliban were engaged in good faith negotiation when they signed their agreement with the United States. There's actually been no evidence to support that proposition in the intervening period, and it was very naive to assume at the outset that good faith, a commitment to the belief that peace was an overarching objective that supervened any Taliban commitment to the use of armed struggle, had come to dominate their thinking. That was simply not the case. A second defect related to process. Initially, when the Americans began exploring discussion with the Taliban, the formula that they put forward was one that said that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Now, this is a reputable formula to use in complex negotiations, because what it implies is that any possible concessions that have been foreshadowed during the process will become concrete if and only if there are reciprocal concessions offered by the other side that are then locked down as part of a final agreement. Instead, the Americans shifted their position before February 2020 in favor of a different approach, one in which they foreshadowed a 2-stage endeavor in which first the United States would strike its own agreement with the Taliban, and then there might be intra-Afghan negotiations to address issues of internal political order. Now, this was a seriously defective approach for the following reason. As it turned out, the United States gave to the Taliban in the 29th February 2020 agreement everything that they really wanted. They gave them the status of a place at the table with the Americans. They gave them a firm timetable for the withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan, and they committed to the release of up to 5,000 combat or political prisoners, which meant that subsequently, there was virtually no incentive for the Taliban to engage in serious or good faith negotiations with the Afghan government. Instead, the Taliban ever since have engaged in what one might call strategic stalling, whereby they occasionally go through the motions of keeping a process going, but do absolutely nothing to give any substance to the expectation that there will be serious good faith negotiations. And this reflected really quite astounding naivete and incompetence on the part of the United States and its negotiators. And the consequences now in Afghanistan have been all too clear. The Americans, frankly, were focused on securing their own exit from Afghanistan, and they did secure from the Taliban a commitment not to attack American forces, but that actually incentivized Taliban attacks on Afghan targets, which have escalated dramatically in the period since the 29th February 2020 agreement. And it was entirely predictable that this would be the case, because even if the Taliban at some point were going to negotiate in good faith with the Afghan government, it was still in their interest to do so from as strong a position as possible, which meant taking any symbolic steps available to them to undermine the reputation and standing of the Afghan government. And I'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, this then fed into a third defect in the process, essentially the implementation phase. And that was because the United States was keen above anything else to exit the theatre of operations, it became notably supine at the point where implementation of the specific commitments of the Taliban came into view. And this was really spectacularly illustrated in the case of Sergeant Hekmatullah, a rogue Afghan army sergeant who had killed 3 young Australian soldiers within their own base in 2012. Now, he'd been sentenced to death in Afghanistan, although had not been executed. And he was by no stretch of the imagination a combat or political prisoner. He was a war criminal under the Geneva Conventions of 1949. But the Taliban added him to the list of people whose release they demanded. And in September last year, the United States switched from a position of supporting Australia's view that under no circumstances should Hekmatullah be released to one of supporting his release, despite a phone call from Prime Minister Morrison to Trump objecting to this happening. Now, the signal that that sent to the Taliban was that the United States was supine in terms of giving effect to the specific provisions of the 29th February agreement, and that was therefore sensible for them to demand more because they were likely to get it. And that, of course, has militated against any good faith consequence flowing from this process. Now, on top of this was the problem of defective psychology. Regimes change in Afghanistan typically not when forces grind their way to the center of Kabul, but when forces that can see which way the wind is blowing shift so that they'll be on the winning side. That means that mass psychology and reputation are actually very important in this kind of theater. Thomas Hobbes in Leviathan said that reputation of power is power. And the approach of the United States has actually been to undermine the reputation of power of the Afghan government and boost the reputation of the Taliban. It would have been better if the Americans had wanted to leave, if they had simply done an agreement with the Afghan government for them to leave without giving status and standing to the Taliban, emboldening their military activities in the intervening period, but they seem not to have appreciated that. And the final defect worth noting here is defective diagnosis. You can really negotiate agreements in these sort of circumstances when the gulf between the parties is not so wide that it's unbridgeable. And the Americans from time to time have sought to convince themselves that what one witnesses in the conflict in Afghanistan is a conflict of interest. Now, there are conflicts of interest in Afghanistan, but there's also a fundamental conflict of values between the more pluralistic approach of those who've supported the post-2001 constitutional order in Afghanistan and the essentially totalitarian mindset which the Taliban still manifest more and more openly in their approach to social life. And bridging the gulf between these different visions is virtually impossible through a diplomatic process. This is one reason why the Taliban have been engaged in strategic stalling, because they've been emboldened to think that they're going to come out on top. And the prospects for Afghanistan are pretty grim as a result of that. So let me now conclude with some comments about more recent developments which have occurred and whether they hold out much hope for the future. Zalmay Khalilzad, the US envoy, if he'd been an ambassador to Afghanistan, probably would have been declared persona non grata for interfering in the country's internal affairs in violation of Article 41 of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, but that hasn't stopped him one bit. And most recently, he and his team floated the idea of replacing the existing government and constitution with an interim government of his devising to be called a peace government, which would carry his peace process forward. Now, interim governments tend to have a very poor history of delivering the goods. Sometimes you can get national governments that work well, like the one in Britain between 1940 and 1945, but it took an existential threat from Germany to bring that into place. And if one looks at things like the Cambodian events post the 1993 election, the Arusha Accords in Rwanda, even the National Unity Government after the 2014 election in Afghanistan, the record is not a good one. And it's because typically these kind of arrangements paper over huge gulfs between the parties. And of course, they can also set the scene for what in the post-World War II Eastern European environment was called salami tactics, where those who controlled the coercive instrumentalities would slice away at other political parties in order eventually to bring themselves to a position of total dominance. And we saw that in Hungary with Marcos Rákosi, with Hun Sen in Cambodia after 1993. It's not encouraging. Now, some Afghan political actors have liked the idea of an interim government because they've seen it as a way of undermining Ashraf Ghani, the incumbent president whom they can't stand. But really what that reflects is that they've lost sight of who the real challenge, what's the real challenge that confronts Afghanistan, which is the Taliban, not the Afghan government. The danger at the moment, therefore, is that the withdrawal of US forces and even the withdrawal of the Australian embassy in Kabul can be the kind of sequence of events that triggers a cascade where lots of people suddenly shift their allegiances so that all the assumptions about a 2 to 3 year period during which forces will adjust their positions are suddenly undermined. And we've seen that kind of thing with sudden regime collapse in 1992 when the communist regime collapsed, and then in 2001 when the Taliban regime collapsed as soon as a stronger force came over the horizon. And that, of course, is complicated by the problem of bad faith in the region, where Pakistan talks sweetly about the situation in Afghanistan, but continues to provide the essential logistical military support which sustains Taliban operations against the Afghan government within the country itself. And that leads to a situation in which the prospects for the population in Afghanistan are far from good. And there are several worries here. One relates to the position of women in Afghanistan, and the Taliban have always been the world's least feminist movement, and there's no suggestion that that's changed. They have a history of hostility towards members of the Hazara ethnic group. There was a massacre of Hazaras by Taliban in August 1998 in Mazar-e Sharif, which was described by the journalist Ahmad Rashid as genocidal in its ferocity. And ultimately, the Taliban are in opposition to the population of Afghanistan. The Asia Foundation survey of opinion in 2019, which is the best indicator by far of popular opinion in Afghanistan, showed that 85.1% of respondents had no sympathy whatsoever for the Taliban. So we're actually staring at a situation in which a terrorist group with the complicity of forces in the United States is positioning itself to try to take over a country not that far from Australia, with potentially dramatically detrimental effects for and consequences for the population of the country itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. Thanks for sticking with the time. You've raised very important point about the US intention to leave and whether or not this was actually a peace deal or an exit plan for the US and perhaps a capitulation, and was seen as a capitulation by the Taliban. This provides us the perfect context for our next speaker, Dr. Ibrahimi. Would you like to take the floor now? Go ahead.
Thank you, Professor Akbarzadeh. I'd like to thank you, MSF at Deakin University, for hosting us and organizing this event. And thank you everyone for joining us. I think this is a very timely discussion on the situation in Afghanistan, given so much has been happening in the country, not least recently the 8 May attack on a school in Kabul, of which I have got a picture in my background now, just to serve as a reminder of the danger that confronts Afghan civilians, this particular group, like Hazaras in particular. So I think, Professor Maley expanded so much. I will just try to build up on his remarks and discuss some of the regional responses to withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan and its potential impact on a peace process in the future in the country. And given the complexity of the situation in Afghanistan, the politics of the region, I will just try to say brief with a few general remarks, and hopefully we can just expand that during the Q&A in the second half of the webinar. Just as a background factor, I think it is important to keep in mind that Afghanistan is located in a very difficult environment, sort of a frontier country where several regions intersect, South Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, and often the politics and policy dynamics of those regions also overlap with global politics and security dynamics in that region. And that has been the case, in fact, since the 1980s, when Afghanistan became one of the major theaters of the Cold War. And then after 1989, when the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, the United States also lost its interest in the country. And during the 1990s, Afghanistan became the theater of proxy conflict between countries in the region. Often some of those groups in Afghanistan were supported by Pakistan in an alliance with Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, but other groups were also supported by India, Iran, Central Asian republics, and Russia. So now the fear is that those sorts of dynamics will revive with the departure of NATO and US forces from Afghanistan. These countries will just try to revert back to those sorts of destructive, competitive, security oriented policies towards Afghanistan. And that will be a recipe for the sort of civil war that we saw in Afghanistan in the second half of the 1990s, in particular with the rise of the Taliban, when we saw really this sort of mass atrocities happening in many parts of Afghanistan. So I think for us to keep in mind, the situation has really dramatically changed with the 9/11 terrorist attack on the United States. And in response, the United States invasion of Afghanistan was broadly welcomed by various countries in the region. That included many countries that are traditionally in competition with the United States in other parts of the world. For example, Iran, which was in competition with the United States in other parts of the Middle East, found itself having a common interest with the United States in Afghanistan. And similarly, Russia, India, and all Central Asian republics, they all supported the United States intervention in Afghanistan, the NATO intervention in Afghanistan. They provided logistics, military bases, and this was also, we should remember, generated out of the sympathy, the global sympathy for the victims of the 9/11 terrorist bombing in the United States. And out of those countries, I think perhaps Pakistan was the only country which was unwillingly sort of intimidated into compliance with the international intervention in Afghanistan in the first few years of the post-2001. And we know this from the records and biographies of many senior Bush administration officials who have revealed some of those conversations they had with President Musharraf and senior Pakistani military officials at that time. So what happened was, while there was this broad strategic regional alignment of factors between global powers like the United States and regional powers like Iran, India, and Russia, we also saw that over time there was also divergence of interest, because many of those countries that had common interest in Afghanistan, they had conflicts of interest in other parts of the world or other parts of the region. For example, Iran, which had this really strong alignment of interest with the United States in establishing a plural democratic order in Afghanistan, found itself in conflict with the United States in the Middle East, especially after the 2003 speech by President Bush, which declared Iran as part of the axis of evil. And similarly, after a while, there was also speculation, suspicions on the part of other powers in the region, including Russia and occasionally China. They also felt that maybe for a while, the United States might have other ambitions geopolitical ambitions in the region beyond Afghanistan. So as a result of this, what we saw after maybe 2005 and 6 was a change in tactics of those countries around Afghanistan towards the US policy goals in that country. So while we saw an unfortunate type of events where many actors tried to play a destabilizing role, try to challenge and hurt the democratic process in Afghanistan, then one should also recognize that these countries had different objectives when it comes to their policy objectives in Afghanistan. There are a lot of speculations and talks about the Pakistani policy objectives in Afghanistan. And as already Professor Maley mentioned, there has been significant evidence that shows Pakistan hosted significant Taliban leadership shuras in many parts of Pakistan. We also saw that other countries like Iran and occasionally Russia, as reports have surfaced recently, they also provided some tactical support to the Taliban. And these are very short-sighted initiatives, which was intended to send a signal to the United States that they could have an interest in Afghanistan, even though they had a shared interest in the sort of plural, democratic, and national government in Afghanistan that was designed to be established after the fall of the Taliban in 2001. So now, at the moment after the declaration by President Biden of the unconditional withdrawal from Afghanistan, and I think many of these powers in the region are sort of surprised. I think probably the mood in Pakistan, at least among some quarters, is one of celebration and joy. We often see that sometimes translating into social media comments about, see, this is what was saying all along. Afghanistan wouldn't stabilize under this sort of political order. But I think, what we see from other countries, there are, a mix of joy and concern. For example, while Iran has welcomed the move by the Biden administration to withdraw from Afghanistan, they have also been increasingly concerned about a potential takeover of the Taliban or military takeover of Afghanistan by the Taliban. And similarly, we have seen China recently, especially after the 8 May attack on the school in Dashburji, they have also been calling on responsible withdrawal from Afghanistan. So while many of these powers shows they had a shared interest in the withdrawal of US and NATO forces from Afghanistan because they had these fears and concerns about the broader geopolitical ambitions of the United States, using Afghanistan as a theater from where they could, for example, influence politics in Central Asia or other parts of the region. Now they are sort of surprised because they didn't see this coming that soon or that quickly. And we must remember that all of these countries have significant stake in what will happen in Afghanistan. In the Central Asian republics, they are very concerned about a triumphant mood among the Taliban, which will inspire a similar reorganization of terrorist groups, extremist groups in Central Asia. There are a significant number of Central Asian fighters in Afghanistan. Some is a small number, but it's still significant concern for the Chinese Uyghur militants in parts of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I think honestly, even in Pakistan, there must also be some concern about the blowback effect of a potential Taliban takeover of Afghanistan. And India, on its part, I think has been a major player in Afghanistan. It has really thrown its weight behind the Afghan government since 2001 by providing significant financial and development aid, sponsoring major infrastructures, which have in fact been a cause of concern for many in Pakistan. So now the question, I think, is whether regional politics will revert back to the 1990s. And I think that is the main fear of people. We will see a repeat of history, as in April of 1992, when President Najibullah was forced to step down, and Afghanistan just disintegrated. And that disintegration was in part precipitated by the way regional countries directed their efforts towards Afghanistan. Some in Pakistan at that time saw this as an opportunity for them to reshape Afghanistan's politics. And obviously they didn't have the sort of monopoly of control over the Afghan groups at that time. And as a result of that, we had the civil war, which began in Kabul and then quickly spread to the rest of Afghanistan. And now, if you look, I think all of these countries have a shared interest in trying to avert that sort of scenario from materializing. I think that will be counterproductive for all of these countries' interest. That will also be counterproductive for Pakistan's interest. I think Pakistan has a really an important interest in stabilizing Afghanistan through a peaceful, inclusive government, which will also provide protection to Afghan refugees who might return to Afghanistan. But at the same time, I think there's also so much that we don't know yet. There is one possibility that some people might try to think history is repeating itself in front of their eyes. It's back April 1992. And we certainly see some resonance of Taliban attitude with that of the Mujahideen in 1992. That this puppet government, which was established by foreigners, is losing its external support and legitimacy, and it is now time for us to take over militarily. But I think there has been much said already, but I think one factor we should keep in mind is that Afghanistan has changed now over the past 20 years, and how the government of Afghanistan now is quite different from that of Dr. Najibullah in April of 1992. And in my view, the main difference is how unpopular the Taliban is in terms of their grassroots legitimacy in the views of everyday Afghans. And also, even though many Afghan political figures and groups do not like Ashraf Ghani and his government, often because of his own policies in recent years, but they also have a significant common interest in supporting a plural democratic government that will also avert a takeover of the Taliban, the country by the Taliban. So I think these are just maybe some general remarks. I would be happy to maybe expand that later. I think I'm within the time now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ibrahimi. That's amazing. You have indeed pointed to a number of regional players, regional actors who all have competing agendas in Afghanistan. And in a way, the US decision to withdraw is creating a power vacuum that they can exploit. And they can exploit to the detriment of the Afghan population. So moving on to the next speaker, I'd like to invite Farkhondeh Akbari to reflect on how the peace process is going and how the population is going to be affected.
Hello, can you hear me?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. And I would like to thank the Middle East Studies Forum and for the platform, and of course the kind Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh for facilitating this timely event. Given that the context provided by Professor Maley and Dr. Ibrahimi about the withdrawal on overall and then in the regional level, I would like to reflect more on the implication of the US and NATO withdrawal on human rights overall and its impact on the vulnerable groups such as women and minorities. And this whole notion of withdrawal already indicates that there is a dire consequences because of this this unconditionality that is attached to it, which could mean the return of the Taliban in some sort, either militarily taking over or a negotiated political settlement. And But to reflect on what consequences the Taliban's return would have for rights for women and for vulnerable group, it might be useful to first reflect on if the Taliban has changed in the last 20 years since they were in power in the 90s, where their human rights records was characterized by systematic violation against women and girls, systematic discrimination, and even persecution against the Hazara ethnic group, for example. There were cruel corporal punishments, suppression of liberal views of anyone, and restriction on expression and on education. The Taliban have certainly changed or evolved militarily as an organization in the last 20 years. They evolved in a network of networks, something the analysts called, and that have a strong command structure and an enduring insurgency in the last 20 years without any major defection. But some other aspects of change that we have observed on the Taliban are, on the Taliban characteristics are their public relation, their engagement with media, they appear on TVs, they're making very good use of communication technology to spread their propaganda, while they have provided no meaningful substance on their position on issues concerning such as rights. But how the Taliban have not evolved or have not changed. We know, and reports have shown, that they have maintained very deep connection with regional and international terrorist organizations, very close ties with Al-Qaeda, but their views on women have not changed much. We know this from the districts under the Taliban control. Women are still prohibited from public life. There are very rare cases of health professionals women health professionals working in women-only clinics, and most girls' schools remain closed. Although in the official statement, Taliban say that they no longer oppose girls' education, but very few Taliban officials permit girls to attend school beyond primary schools, and many others don't permit girls' school at all. There are some inconsistencies from village to village based on whoever commander is in charge in whatever village, and also depending on locals' negotiation and on the overall mood in the community. But the bottom line is that Taliban, for the Taliban, it still means no girls' education past a certain age. In the last 2 years, that there has been a more regular diplomatic engagement with the Taliban, we observe that there is a lack of clarity on what the Taliban want, and what the future of Afghanistan looks like to them, and how they envision peace for Afghanistan. The lack of those details fit into people's concerns to the extent that they cannot be trusted. Is it that the Taliban have not met or thought through their policies, or is it that they're going to continue their policies from the time of their rule? They have instead strategically framed their messaging very vaguely under the framing or the pretext of Islamic, just to avoid scrutiny. Now that the internationals are withdrawing and the Taliban's jihad is being called by the locals, and beyond that, it is illegitimate. It's illegitimate for them to continue fighting. The emphasis on the justification for the continuation of jihad for the Taliban is until and unless there is an Islamic system in place, and rolling back all the gains that have been made in the last 20 years. And that means they have to fight back to Afghan people. There was a recent Taliban statement released by their spokesperson that anyone who have worked for the government or who have assisted in the post-2001 era is a legitimate target to be killed. This statement was released while the US had already signed an agreement with the Taliban, and the so-called intra-Afghan negotiation has been going on. That's just the context of how much we know if the Taliban have changed or not, because there has been a lot of debate among the Western circles and in the national level as well, that, hey, the Taliban have changed, we should move on. But I wanted to give you that context, which is important in our discussion today on women's rights and other vulnerable groups. I'll make a few comments on women's rights in Afghanistan. 20 years on, after the slogan that the US and the US made about unveiling Afghan women to liberate Afghan women, which was probably one of the most human imagery of the war on terror. But now with this unconditional withdrawal, it puts women's rights in a disadvantaged position, as the future of Afghan women will be completely up to the outcomes of the intra-Afghan negotiations, if there is one, a meaningful one, and most probably it's going to depend on the battlefield developments. And the main achievements that we want to protect, or the Afghan people want to protect, are those that were gained in the last 20 years. Girls' education, protecting gender equality in the current constitution, and the institutionalization of women representation in the political and public life. But these limited achievements are very likely to unravel, and the space for agency is likely to shrink for women. And there are probably some 3.3 million girls in school now, and their fate is going to be uncertain as well. So in any of the scenarios that are likely to unfold, it's either more war and complete takeover of the Taliban, or it's an elite power sharing settlement between the different stakeholders, including the government. Women's rights will be impacted profoundly because the Taliban has a very strong view on women, and their demand are on filtering women's rights from their interpretation of Islamic values. And then on the other hand, there are doubts on how women's rights would be defended by the Republic Front when pressures are there, and there's bargaining going on with the Taliban, and then the battlefield is hot. When I was speaking with women politicians in Kabul on how confident they are that in a settlement with the Taliban, would the Republic Front protect women's rights? One of them very frankly said to me that she's not fearful for the Taliban, but she fears for the Talibanic ideology in Afghanistan. And then in another encounter, another very prominent Afghan woman politician told me that during the power distribution between President Ghani and then Chief Executive Dr. Abdullah, none of them wanted the Ministry of Women to be part of their portion of power, because the minister then had to be a woman, and they could not share it with their loyalists, who are almost always men, almost always one of those mujahideen or warlords. So in the so-called intra-Afghan negotiation delegation, there are only 4 women in the 21 member, and of course no women represented from the Taliban's delegation. And it was in March this year, I think, when the delegation went to Moscow, but from both sides, there was only one woman representing Afghan women, Dr. Habiba Sorabi. She was the only woman in some 40 plus Afghan men talking about the fate of Afghanistan. Nowadays that I have been observing in the current political consensus building efforts that's going on in Kabul, we see no woman in the room in most of those meetings, like the stakeholders of war, in peacetime too, or in whatever the future is for Afghanistan. It is the same people who have been involved in the war. It's the former Mujahideen and then the political elites that have emerged in post-2001, which are all men. So all of these I wanted to highlight is because it reveals that in the last 20 years, women's rights in Afghanistan, I mean, there have been gains, but they remain symbolic. The gains are fragile and vulnerable, and the gains are also vulnerable for bargaining without meaningful presence of women and participation of women. It is not about the number of women that I want to bring into your attention. It's just to show that how absence of women and then how the narrative and the discourse was there for women's rights in the last 20 years, but when it comes to practical steps, they remain symbolic. And now that the Taliban are going to be part of the future of Afghanistan legitimately, it's taking it to another threatening level for Afghan women. I would like to also reflect on some comments or make some comments on the vulnerability of the Hazara ethnic group as a group that are considered vulnerable because they have been historically targeted by the Taliban. Hazaras faced mass massacre, persecution during the Taliban regime, both because of their racial background and their religious affiliation, the majority of whom follow the Shia sect of Islam, and they were also declared infidels by the Taliban. And then just how we have seen that the Taliban's position on women have not changed. Unfortunately, we have not seen a change in their attitude towards the Hazaras as well. The Taliban have sort of positioned themselves very ambiguous and contradictory towards things like a non-discriminatory political order in Afghanistan. And that continue to threaten Hazaras' security and their fundamental human right. Not just the Hazaras, but also the other minorities, such as the Hindu Sikh in Afghanistan. One example that the Taliban still continue that policy is what we have observed from the Taliban chief of the political office, Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar. He spoke at the inauguration ceremony of the intra-Afghan negotiation it was last year, 12th of September. And then he highlighted in his speech about respect for inclusivity, non-discriminatory approach for future of Afghanistan. But then 3 weeks later from the negotiation on rules and procedure, there was a deadlock on the talks on two issues, one of which was the Taliban are not going to accept a provision that recognized the right of the Shia and the Jafari jurisprudence along with the Hanafi jurisprudence. And I think this really showed this far that there is so limited substance emerging from the Taliban. This was one of them, and which only showed their continuous rigidity and their maintenance of discriminatory policy. Today, the Hazaras are considered even more vulnerable than the past because of their meaningful participation in the democratization process. The Hazara communities and activists have been leading advocacy efforts in civil society, in democracy and human rights, and they have embraced these values in community levels in far villages of Hazarajat. During elections, voter turnouts are always highest in Hazara provinces, of course, always with very large and colorful participation of women. But now there are fears that Taliban might also avenge the Hazaras for their cooperation with the state in the post-2001 democratic order, and the Hazaras' refusal to participate in a jihad against international forces. And in other way, looking at the vulnerability of the Hazara, their relative success in post-2001 is also part of a massive part of the extremist narrative that justifies violence against them. There's a perception that the Hazaras have stepped out of their historical role as inferiors, as subordinates, and hence they should be pushed back. In the last 6-7 years, we are observing a chain of attacks on the Hazaras in Dasht-e-Barchi in particular. It's a populated area in Hazara populated area in west of Kabul, targeting schools, education centers, sports centers, and even maternity hospital. The main target has been the young generation of the Hazaras who have been educated, and the last one, which Dr. Ibrahimi highlighted as well, was the triple bombing of girls' school that killed over 100 and wounded another 200 students. Just 2 days ago, there was another suicide bomber who was spotted by the locals near one of the girls' school in Dasht-e-Barchi as well. I mean, there has been also a lack of recognition of these attacks against the Hazaras as a targeted attack based on their identity. So far, not a single perpetrator has been brought to justice by the government, and most of the attacks also goes unclaimed. And this is becoming a pattern in Afghanistan, where soft targeted attacks are unclaimed, and sometimes, I mean, some of them have been claimed by ISIS, but there are many that haven't been claimed, such as the maternity hospital and also the school bombing. The Hazara community is deeply concerned that the attacks on Hazaras would continue under this so-called unclaimed attack or under the pretext of the ISIS, even if there is going to be any peace settlement with the Taliban. I'll quickly also talk about another category that I think are vulnerable in this scenario that we are in, and they are the Afghan journalists. Since the US-Taliban agreement was signed, Professor Maley reflected on it very comprehensively about the flaws with it, but the Taliban were limited to conducting certain acts of violence. That is why it is claimed that the Taliban have changed their tactics and began attacking places and targeted people where the psychological effects are much more profound, and it's not part of their, like, the very usual patterns of their violence. And the new targets are people such as religious scholars, youth, media outlets, journalists, but to see these are the people who have been challenging the Taliban's war and their legitimacy. Today, I mean, since 2018, January 2018 till January this year, there has been over 65 journalists, media professionals, and human rights defenders killed in Afghanistan. And most of those attacks and assassination have gone unclaimed as well. Human Rights Watch report shows that Taliban commanders and fighters have been engaged in a pattern of threats, intimidation, and violence against members of the media in areas where Taliban have significant influence, but as well as Kabul and other places. Those who make these threats, those commanders know about the journalists' work, their family, their movement, and then they use those personal information to compel them that to self-censor, to leave their work or face violent consequences. These threats are made orally, and there have been cases where these threats were written down and sent to journalists in other parts of the countries where the Taliban's control is limited. And as a result, we have seen dozens of esteemed journalists escaping the country. And the journalist community feel that they are a target because they are not neutral in this war. They say that they are standing for people, they're standing for human rights. And that's why it automatically puts them on a front line, and it also makes a political statement. And now the journalists of Afghanistan are on a front line and fighting. Just to conclude, with how things are evolving in Afghanistan, it is difficult to see a meaningful peace process to succeed when there is no international pressure on the withdrawal or international pressure on the Taliban, and that's as a result of the withdrawal because it's attached to that unconditionality. And from my own studies, what I have I can gather is that I believe the Taliban are using diplomacy, and they're not abandoning the talk completely, but they're barely maintaining their presence on the negotiating table. Just to use that platform to utilize their military objectives, but no meaningful engagement, of course, as we have seen in the last 1 or 2 years with the US, and then since September with the Afghan parties. I'll stop here, but happy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Did I go over time?
Thank you so much. No, perfect timing, perfect timing. Some sobering remarks. I already see that hands are going up, so please use the raise hand function on Zoom. We are now experts, professionals on Zoom, every one of us. Raise hand function, I'll call on you to ask a question. Please introduce yourself. Keep your question brief because we do have about 30 minutes or so for Q&A. Keep your question brief, and I also invite the panel members to keep your responses brief so we can go through all the questions. So the first question is by Muzaffar Ali.
Thank you very much, Bill, Mr. Ibrahimi, and Aghay Farkhondeh. My question is about the people of Afghanistan. What we see that overwhelming majority of Afghanistan population is the young Afghans who had nothing to do with the civil war during 90s. They tested democratic system. And now when everything is going on, it's behind closed doors by the Taliban, by the US, and there is very little stake by the Afghan people to have their say and to continue their aspirations. So they have, Afghans during the course of history, they have tested communism, Islamic system during jihad, and Taliban system and democracy now. But all of these have eventually failed in terms of development, governance, democratic process, and everything is falling apart. So I am very concerned about the missing voice of ordinary Afghan people. Whatever we say here, we don't talk about the Afghan people and where they should go, where they should raise their voice, how their voice are heard. And what is the solution, a proper solution that is not parachuted on the Afghan people, but it comes from the grassroots. The change should come from the Afghan people, not from the upper side.
Thank you very much. Farkhondeh, would you like to have a go at that question?
I would leave it to Dr. Ibrahimi and Professor Maley, but I'll just make a very short comments, and that is that in a political settlement, peace process is always difficult, and political settlements itself, it goes to the stakeholders who have a power, or they have been sharing power. And the one in the Afghani version of it that we are seeing, people even more sidelined. It's always as I mentioned in my talk, it's always those leaders who have been involved in the wars. They're the one who are going to make the decision for peace. For grassroots level, I think that requires grassroots level movements, and that change is going to be very slow for Afghan people to identify their agency. It's limited, but I think there are space in Afghanistan, knowing that we have this very young generation post 2001, and they don't have, I mean, if you go and ask young people from all ethnic groups, most of them are not happy with people who represent them. And there is this sense of dissatisfaction, and I think there will be some sort of movement going on and change among the people on the mentality of holding this sort of warlord or stakeholders responsible in the future about fate. But unfortunately, the settlement itself, it's going, if there is one, it will be an elite settlement, and in elite settlement, and things we have seen in the last 20 years, values are sidelined. It's about power. It's about who gets what of the portion of the power. And our work would be grassroots, very, very slow, but important to begin. And I think there are agency, just the fact that we are speaking today. Thanks.
Thank you. Any more thoughts from Nemat or Bill? Go ahead, Bill.
Muzaffar, having worked for the UN at grassroots level in Afghanistan, is very aware of how important that particular framework is for generating possibilities of cooperation between different groups. And really one of the tragic things about the whole process that instead has evolved since 2018 is that it's really been a fast-tracked, rabbit out of the hat approach, which scarcely ever works in delivering peace. Because when you've had conflict for as long as Afghanistan has experienced, and it's worth noting here that the period since the 1978 coup is now longer than the period between the Wright brothers plane flying for the first time and Hiroshima being bombed in 1945. It's a long period of time. When that happens, there's no easy fix, because there are far too many complex tensions that need to be methodically addressed at all levels of a society, and that's where the grassroots are important. It's not just a kind of touchy-feely negotiation that you get out with the people, but it's rather that it's not going to work unless you actually address the scale of interconnected distrust that tends to permeate societies. And the worst thing that you can do under those circumstances is actually to go for the fast track process, because what it typically does is marginalize the grassroots and mid-level actors and instead privilege the position of people who are seen not as constructive builders for the future, but as potential spoilers who might wreck an agreement if they're not given a piece of the action. And that's why, in a sense, we've seen all sorts of elderly people who, by any stretch of the imagination, are part of the problem rather than part of the solution, being promoted most recently in the idea of a state council. This is a rogues gallery of people I remember from the early 80s when I was interviewing people in Pakistan. And they're not the future of Afghanistan. It's a country with 70% of the population under the age of 30. And Muzaffar's absolutely right. These are the people who are completely marginalized in the process, but they're also being hit as part of the Taliban process of eliminating as methodically as they can people who are seen as likely to be potential opponents of a totalitarian form of rule in the future. And in fact, the blithe notion, Afghanistan can't go back to the past because civil society is different, has in fact shoved civil society actors into the front line for attack. Civil society in Afghanistan is extremely vibrant, but it's also fragile. The Weimar Republic had a vibrant civil society until 1933 in Germany, but the civil society actors there were among the very first people whom the Nazis sought to take down when they came to power. And that's one of the things that I fear in Afghanistan now.
Okay, I think we're going to move on to next question. Sajjad Askari, would you like to unmute?
Thanks, Professor. My name is Sajjad Askari. I'm a law student from Monash University. So upon a full foreign withdrawal in the next few months, Professor Maley, how do you envision the situation for the Hazaras for the future in Afghanistan, keeping in mind the cycle of target attacks in recent years and tragic attacks on the girls' schools in Dashti-Barshi, Kabul in May 8th? So my question is, how can Hazaras protect and shield themselves from these brutal attacks? Thank you.
Thanks, Sajjad. There's no doubt that the Hazaras are in an extremely vulnerable situation in Afghanistan. A combination of a relatively distinct appearance combined with the assumption that the bulk of the Hazara population are Shia rather than Sunni has put them in the crosshairs for extremist groups, whether we're talking about ISIS, which tends to claim responsibility for its attacks, and the Taliban, who really, in order not to upset the Americans, have not been doing so in recent times, but both have long histories of brutal suppression of elements of the Hazara population in Afghanistan. I suspect that what we will witness if the situation takes the worst possible turn is huge refugee movements out of Afghanistan. A couple of years ago, Farkhondeh and I were at a conference in Singapore where a very prominent American official who was very skeptical about the so-called peace process predicted 5 to 6 million refugees fleeing Afghanistan. And one of the things that I think is very important is that Western governments be prepared for this to happen and don't seek to go down the path of pretending that anytime soon it's going to be safe for Hazaras to be able to go back to Afghanistan, because that would be wishful thinking. When the Taliban were in power in the late 1990s and I was traveling there, I frequently found people who recognized that the situation was truly awful, but felt that it was so bad that an international intervention would have to happen at some stage in order to address the problem of this bizarre movement that had emerged with repressive tendencies. And indeed, fortuitously, that did happen. But if there's a collapse in Afghanistan in the near future, no one is going to entertain the belief that there's going to be yet another foreign intervention in order to reverse the circumstances, and that will make exit the most obvious approach for people to take who otherwise are at risk of being killed by a group like ISIS or the Taliban. And that could lead to very substantial refugee flows of people who would indisputably be refugees within the meaning of the term in the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees. And this is one reason why the Europeans are actually taking a much greater interest in Afghanistan now than they were even 6 to 8 months ago, because America is not going to face refugee flows from Afghanistan. You know, you'd have to get across the Atlantic, but the Europeans could. It's, I think, very important also for Hazara groups in Western countries to use every resource at their disposal to try to highlight this particular danger. And of course, it goes without saying that Hazaras in Australia who are on temporary protection visas should be granted permanent protection immediately rather than having to live with the uncertainty that otherwise haunts their lives, because it's plainly ridiculous to suggest at the moment that there's any prospect of Hazaras being able to return safely to Afghanistan.
Thank you. Niamat, do you have anything on that point?
No, I think Bill said it all well. I think I don't want to take any repeat.
Okay, so we go to our next question. Musa Zafar, please go ahead.
Yeah, hello everyone, and thank you very much for this very timely discussion. I'm Musa Zafar, social policy student of Fiji National University. I think there were two points that all the panelists missed, or I missed actually, and did not hear anything about. That was the notion of justice. No one really talked. In the last 20 years, we had a great opportunity to bring to justice those warlords or people who committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in the past decades. Given the social rift in Afghanistan, we see that like Mazari, Khalili, Mohakik were heroes for Hazaras, the same way Masood was a hero for Tajiks. So why should we expect from Pashtuns to bring to justice people like Mullah Umar and other Taliban, other Taliban leaders, or even other Pashtuns to justice? I think that point gave a very great leverage to Zalmay Khalilzad when he went to the negotiation table with Taliban and struck the deal on 29 February 2020. Not a single word was mentioned in that document about justice, about the atrocities, about the war crimes and crimes against humanity that Taliban are committing. The other thing that I missed was not only from the Taliban or the other terrorist group minorities are threatened, but also by people in the government. We see that not a good share of power is being shared with minorities. only 2 weeks or 3 weeks ago, Mullah Niazi, who gave fitwa for killing of Hazaras or Shias in Mazar Sharif, died in Herat. And he was buried there with great honor. And it looked like there was sort of support even by the government to give that opportunity to the Taliban to bury their leader without any problem. I would like any one of the panelists to, especially Professor Maley, to, if you could elaborate on that. Thanks.
Thank you.
I'm happy to offer a couple of comments there. I think the obsequies for Abdul Manan Niazi were a scandal beyond measure. If there was ever somebody who should have been roasting in the flames of hell, it was Niazi. And his inflammatory rhetoric that led to massacres in Mazar-e-Sharif in August 1998 was extremely well documented by Human Rights Watch, and also noted by Rupert Colville in an article that appeared at the time in the International Herald Tribune. So there's no ambiguity about the appalling record of abominations for which he was responsible, and that should have shaped his exit from the world as well. On the issue of transitional justice, indeed, it is a huge problem that the kind of negotiations that we've witnessed in recent years, but also political developments within Afghanistan, have created a very strong atmosphere of impunity for actors right across the political spectrum, which then leaves Afghans with a very justifiable sense that the wider world is not interested in the notion of justice. Now, one of the complicating factors is that it's difficult even to translate the expression transitional justice into Afghan languages, and the UN has struggled with ways in which they can go about doing that. But people know what it means, that if particular actors have been involved in gross human rights violations and mass atrocities in the past, they shouldn't be able to be treated as if the slate has been wiped clean. And this is not just a problem that's arisen in Afghanistan. It's arisen in so-called peace processes in many different parts of the world, where those who are seen as essential participants if a process is to proceed effectively are also people who have been involved in human rights violations or sundry atrocities in the past. And international actors have not actually found their way to a principled mechanism for addressing this, because it actually, it's not just a matter of principle against pragmatism. It's actually two different ethical systems at play. One is a deontological system which is concerned with rights, and the other is a consequentialist system which is concerned with consequences. And these are really irreconcilable ethical positions, each of which has its own strong defenders. And it just simply happens to be the case that the issue that you've highlighted is an extraordinarily pertinent illustration of just how challenging these problems are in concrete circumstances.
Thank you for that. Nemat, do you have something on that
I
point?
might just very quickly add, I think Musa Zafar has really brought a powerful point here with regards to accountability for war crimes, which are often believed to be an issue of the past, right? But as we know from what is happening on a day-to-day basis in Afghanistan, from 8th May, attack on the school in Dashti-Barchi, this is happening now. And this is going to be, I think, a major part of how Afghans on a day-to-day basis relate to a new cycle of war and violence, or if there is a peace settlement with it. So I think, I would just probably like to add to what Professor Maley said, that there is now an obligation on the part of the Afghan government to prosecute certain types of crimes under the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. And in 2002 and 2003, I remember I was in Kabul. Many international actors said, well, we Afghans don't need justice now, we just need peace, right? And that was essentially a thinking which created a culture of impunity, which is so well entrenched now in every part of the Afghan politics and society and economy. And I think now in 2021, for the past 19 years, now Afghanistan has an obligation to prosecute these sorts of crimes. And if they don't do that, I think the International Criminal Court can step in. So I think there is a room for thinking how that sort of process can be linked to a process of reconciliation and justice in Afghanistan, because ICC is there, it will do it under the Rome Statute, have that mandate. And that will always be part of, I think, the problem in Afghanistan, given that, increasingly, increasing evidence of all sorts of crimes, crime against humanity, war crimes. Now there's increasing talk of genocidal nature of these attacks towards the Hazaras. And I think that will be part of the conversation. I think, thank you for bringing this up.
Thank you for that. Moving on to our next question, Dr. Pargu.
Hello, everybody, and thank you. I'm Mahmoud Pargu from Alfred Deakin Institute. I was wondering, this situation of withdrawal of the US and NATO from Afghanistan, any one of you, do you think that it may provide a good context for Iran to arm probably Hazaras and maybe other groups like Tajiks? They have kind of traditional, good relationships with Iranians, and make something like Hezbollah, and I don't know. And already we have a very, very good, military, say, cooperation between Iran and probably tens of thousands of Hazaras who are stationed in Syria and Iraq, not in Iraq, in Syria. They have a very good battle experience, battle hardened, and I think it's a very good context. What do you think?
I think that's a question for Dr. Ibrahimi.
I think that's a very complex question to deal with, and I think that a question which must also be seen in the context of increasing vulnerability of the Hazaras. And I think the way sometimes these narratives about Iranian policies in Afghanistan and the use of the groups like Fatemiyun is, I think, feeding into this extremist violence which is targeting the Hazaras. I think this is an area which must be dealt with quite carefully, I think, for us as an analyst and scholars, because I think the Iranians' policy towards Syria and Iraq cannot very easily be translated into the situation in Afghanistan. I think for those of you who might be interested, Professor Akbarzadeh and I published an article in Third World Quarterly last year, which looked at the role of Iran's rapprochement with the Taliban in recent years. So I think in recent years, Iran has sort of tried to diversify its approach towards Afghanistan, tried to reach out to various actors, which includes the Taliban, which is regarded as a hostile force in the country in the late 1990s. So, Iran has also tried to build relations within the Afghan government, tried to use media and other sorts of influences. And within that, I think, this whole Fatemiyun brigade or division is, I think, quite a controversial one in Afghanistan, including among the Shias, Hazaras, because many people are quite, in fact, angry about the fact that many of these young people are recruited and exploited in situations of extreme circumstances against their will, often, and used as a cannon fodder in conflicts like those in Syria. And I think that would probably, inflame the conflict in Afghanistan. And I don't see that sort of social and political environment in which that sort of sectarian approach would work for Iran in Afghanistan either. So I think, probably I'm speaking a bit too much, but I think that's important to keep in mind how even sometimes in Tehran, some officials might try to use these groups as sort of signaling their capacity to hurt other actors. I think the point I was trying to mention earlier for Tehran, it is one of those several instruments that they try to use to signal to the Saudis, to the Americans, to the others, here is my influence and this is what I can mobilize. But I think they're also at the end of the day quite pragmatic in terms of what they would like to achieve in different contexts. Maybe, I don't know, William Maley, you would like to add? Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we move to the next question now. Liz Bolton.
Yeah, hi, thanks very much for some really insightful discussion today. I finished a PhD at ANU last year in climate security, and I'm just wondering about some of the things like COVID, climate that might bear upon it, but also, you know, I guess connected with climate is the issue of, and environmental issues in general, is the question of Afghan's natural resources and the role of multinationals in these discussions. And I'm actually wondering, I'm thinking of, you know, the apartheid, the pressure that was put onto South Africa with apartheid from the international community, that if there is any leverage point around any of these areas that could help.
Okay, who would like to take that? Bill.
Climate issues are actually very important in Afghanistan, and there's been a relatively recent study that Dr. Ibrahimi and I noted in a book that came out last year called Afghanistan Politics and Economics in a Globalizing State, that identified potentially very serious impacts on agricultural productivity and water flows within Afghanistan in the next 20 to 30 years, that there are parts of Afghanistan which are intensely vulnerable to climate change, and really no one has even begun at this point to think seriously about what the ramifications might be for the sustainability of the population. On the whole, Afghanistan has not been a country with a problem of famine, although there was a famine in 1972, and it's had relatively high levels of agricultural productivity, but with a rapidly growing and young population and the threat of climate change, it may well be that before too long, Afghanistan is going to be in a position where it has nowhere near the capacity to generate through its internal economy the foodstuffs that are necessary to sustain the population. So it's actually a very important issue that needs to be taken into account. COVID is having huge effects in Afghanistan at the moment, but I have scarcely any friend in Afghanistan who hasn't lost relatives in the last 6 months, but it's often not diagnosed as COVID. People die, there aren't tests to determine the exact cause of death. They're rapidly buried in accordance with local tradition, and that's that. I don't think one should underestimate the seriousness of the problem. Less than 1% of the population has been vaccinated up to this point, so there's still an intense vulnerability there. I don't think we're even close to seeing the beginning of the end of the COVID problem in Afghanistan.
Okay. Are there any more comments from the panel? Because we are going to conclude the session now. Any final thoughts that our panel members would like to share?
Just very quickly, Shahram, I noticed that in the chat there was a question about 8,000 US private contractors in Afghanistan. The US Taliban agreement of the 29th of February provided for the withdrawal of contractors as well as military personnel. The Taliban were careful to stitch up that particular potential loophole whereby the Americans might withdraw their uniformed personnel but equip non-uniform contractors like Blackwater to play a similar kind of role at some point in the future. So the expectation is that contractors will be withdrawn as well.
Right. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Professor Maley, Dr. Ibrahimi, Farkhondeh, Akbar. I'd like everyone to join me in thanking our panel of experts.
Thank you.
A Zoom clap.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Shahram, for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.